I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Once the Criminal Assets Bureau, once they start the machine rolling, it doesn't really stop. It just keeps going. And it's a small town. It's not a big international drug dealer, but it's somebody who's, a corrosive influence in a small town, in a community. It keeps the criminal justice system on its toes, that, the best minds are there and they're getting paid. Nobody's cutting corners and justice is being seen to be done, which I think is important.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the sins of the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. From a notorious robber who splurged on properties and a 6-week Florida holiday, to a gangland criminal whose Dublin mammy tried to help him get back his cash in the attic. The targets of the Criminal Assets Bureau are both wide and varied. Today, I'm talking to journalist Eamon Dillon as we dip into the latest cab listings before the High Court and give listeners a snapshot of their work. We talk about the colourful and eagle-eyed judge who presides over the list, about the cases that come before him, and about the lengths that some will go to hang on to their ill-gotten gains. This is Crime World, a podcast from SundayWorld.com. Eamon, you were attending the monthly cab list this week, and I just asked you, I'm so glad you want to talk about this because, this is a bit train spottery. But anyway, Justice Alexander Owens, who presides over the Criminal Assets Bureau lists, he's a bit of a character, isn't he?
Yeah, he seems the perfect fit for it though as well. But it's certainly, it's not the place you'd want to go in half-cocked as a barrister, going in front of Alex Owens and not having your, not being right across your brief, because if there's a mistake, he'll point it out to you. It's like he's read the brief for both sides perfectly, and then he's sitting on the bench and he's there to make the judgment. But he goes to incredible trouble to make sure he understands everything. And I think he seems to be quite the expert on sort of, questions of tax, on accountancy, and about how accountancy is done. Like he's all over the difference between net and gross figures and expenses and revenue returns, and whether something is reported to your accountant doesn't necessarily mean it's true. He's incredibly evidential based. Like everything has to be backed up by something. The way they work, in that you'll have a chief cab officer will make a statement of belief, and that's put in an affidavit, and so-and-so is a serious criminal, and that we believe this house was bought for that from the proceeds of crime. And then all the supporting affidavits are brought in from different people who've number crunched and gone through all the bank accounts or dug up the bucket with the cash in it or whatever they've done to show where the money has come from. And that's all he's interested in. I mean, interestingly enough, in one of the cases this week, he said something along the lines of, in reply to one of the barristers who talked about, the societal good that the criminal assets legislation does. And he said, look, it doesn't come into it. It said it's got nothing to do with it. It's all about whether or not an asset was purchased with the proceeds of crime, and that and that was his view. It seemed, as far as he is concerned, any benefit to society accruing from that, well, that's just, it's a lucky bonus, but it's not the job of the legislation to take that into account, and he certainly doesn't.
No, I mean, from the moment he started, and he's actually kind of new enough to it, I think he's there maybe 2 years, and maybe it's 3. We all seem to have lost a couple of years. And he certainly was sitting during COVID, and anytime he could, he was in the courtroom. He was on top of his game with the remote hearings. He doesn't rush things through, but he gets things through the courts. He's anything but dithering. And yeah, I agree with you. I think he's the perfect fit for the Criminal Assets Bureau cases. They're complex. They are very largely mathematical, and he has certainly the brain power for it. Somebody could come in and kind of think he's a bit of a walkover, and he's absolutely anything but. He's absolutely all over both sides, and definitely can correct and point out mistakes to them. So anyway, that was
actually
that out of the way.
Before you finish on that, even like during COVID, he mentioned in one of the cases this week, there was a big chunk of the affidavits were the ins and outs of these bank accounts. And he said, well, look, I actually read them. He says, I went through them all during COVID. He said, I was bored and I sat at the kitchen table and went through them all. So there's no need to go through everything, and kind of gave a quick synopsis. And, the Council for the State's kind of more or less, yeah, that's right. And on they went. So like he's incredibly good at shortcutting. And one of his final lines, before he was reserving judgment in another case, and he just said, look, he says, the first thing I do is look at what the silent witnesses tell me. So that's all that kind of paperwork and certification and the stories from from the affidavits, and it's only then he'll go back to see the various people with their axes to grind, as he put it. He'll go back and see what they say, and if they don't coincide, he'll make his judgment based on that. So he's quite a forensic sort of
he's
judge.
He's not the man to try and pull one over on now, I can tell you. So the cab lists, as they call it, come up once a month during court terms, and they're basically, there's cases that can be heard, that are ready to be heard. There's cases that are for mention. Some of them seem to kick along for years on end on the court. Some of them will disappear off into criminal proceedings, and then they'll come back. Sometimes they'll be adjourned if there is a criminal proceeding going alongside it. And others, there'll be appeals and various things like that, which can delay them. But, you'll always find a juicy story on the cab list. And if you go and sit in the courtroom, and any member of the public is welcome to do that, you can be entertained, shall we say, by some of the stories and the background to some of these cases. Now, we're just going to take a little snapshot at one day of these proceedings, just to see who's up, who's getting their money taken, and who's going to be able to keep the keys of the house. And you were in this week. The High Court, of course, is where it happens. These are civil proceedings, Eamon.
Yeah, they're not criminal proceedings. So the kind of the level of proof isn't the same as a criminal level. It's on the balance of probabilities as opposed to beyond all reasonable doubt. So basically, if somebody said they bought €365,000 worth of a house, as Stephen Saunders said, and he paid his mortgage through his plastering business, but there was absolutely no evidence that a plastering business was ever worked at, then that's the case pretty much proved. I think the legislation was clever in that sense when it was first brought in, that it switched the onus of proof onto the accused, so that if you have £2 million, there has to be a logical explanation for it. So it's either you got it from crime or you got it from legitimate sources. So, and if you can't prove you got it from legitimate sources, and guards are giving evidence to say Nicola Tallant is the leader of an organised crime group, then if you have this £2 million, in your bathroom, that has to be explained, and you can't just say, well, I was playing cards for a week in Macau or somewhere, or in Hong Kong. Like, you'll actually have to go and get the plane tickets and the CCTV from the casino and receipts, and you will have to prove it. Otherwise, they'll say, no, that's just on the balance of probability. That's not true. That's money from criminal activity, and we're taking it, and that's it.
Yeah. And they look for where the money goes into accounts, or whether if it's cash in the attic, where it could possibly be from. People come up with all sorts of excuses a lot of the time. I've sat through these cab cases. There's been an awful lot of people claiming that they've been gifted this money or cash to buy houses, etc., from their parents. And often enough parents are wheeled in, sometimes even in wheelchairs, to give evidence to that, to say the same. And sometimes it's believed, sometimes there's just not enough in it. Now, Stephen Saunders, you mentioned, he was up. He has been trucking along in that cab list for a couple of years now. He's known or suspected of being a prolific tiger kidnapper, a man who has just been released recently from prison after serving time for his role in a attempted ATM robbery.
So good criminal pedigree there, but he's been looking for free legal aid. Is he still at that, or has he been refused that?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm not sure where that ended up. They made a big deal of looking for it and pointed out the fact that he hadn't worked since he got out of jail. He was on his €200 a week social welfare, and his wife Tammy was on €350 from the pandemic unemployment payments at the time. And they had expenses of $2,300 a month, including whatever bills they had to pay. I think they'd actually stopped paying the mortgage on the house at the time. So, I mean, they were making the case, look, they can't fight a high court case. They can't afford to pay for senior counsel to take this on. And it's not only the likes of counsel you need, you also need forensic accountants. You need possibly, some of these kind of tax consultants to produce an expert report to show that, your expenditure, your outgoings did actually match your legitimate outcome or your legitimate income. Whereas, the CAB have all those officers themselves who will have done all that work when they've built the case against the likes of Saunders. What was interesting, I think, about the hearing this week, it was actually the hearing. It was finally, I think it's a 2020 case. So it was filed in 2020.
It's been there for a while.
Now presumably, I think the investigation by CAB, I think, might have started back in 2016 when he went into custody for the Dunboyne robbery. But it turned up in court yesterday. In a way, it's funny how these things work. It mentioned a relative of his wife had been investigated by CAB in 2005, around that period, and that some of his bank accounts were looked at the time, and nothing untoward was found. Now, this was used by his counsel, his defence counsel, to say, look, it's not justice to go back over his accounts again and now suddenly find errors with them that or warning flags or whatever you want to call it this time around, whereas the last time there was nothing wrong, so why should you be looking at him so closely? And they were actually trying to make the argument that when he went on the acquisition period, as they called it, when he bought two houses including his family home in Clonee, they were trying to make the point that at this stage he didn't have any convictions, that his first conviction, which is true, didn't happen until the 2016 robbery, for which he got 10 years, and that before that all his income was legitimately earned. And they were trying to say he ran a plastering business, I think, and his wife Tammy had, she was involved in various businesses. One of them was curtains and blinds. They'd taken over as a going concern a hair salon in Finglas. The manager there was kept on, but all the staff were basically made redundant, and the new staff were a lot of them were relatives of the Saunders. This is what it was said in court yesterday.
Yeah.
And then, of course, with they go, like you're saying, members of the public would be welcome to come along and watch, but I don't think they'd be thanking you, Nicola, because some of it is pretty arcane,
so complex.
and it's like you're kind of sitting there wondering, I hope eventually at the end of this big long to and fro about bank accounts, they're going to do it in a nice simple line for us simple journalists to understand. But I mean, they were talking about the 360 paid on his Clonee home back in, I think it was 2005 or 2006, and that 50,000 of a gift from a relative, and then there was I think another 14,000 in kind of costs, and that certain things were paid for in cash, that the mortgage was paid from these companies that were basically described as money laundering exercises. So I mean, you're basically you get a legitimate mortgage on the back, presumably his application, included his tax returns, or his company returns, or he was self-employed as a plasterer. So this would have been kind of self-declared. So I mean, there was never an accountant pouring through invoices or anything like that. So I mean, accountants take people at their word and do their revenue returns for them. So again, there was no evidence found of this work being done. And there was 120,000 extension done on his house, which was paid for in cash. And then the relative who lent him 50 grand.
That's a phenomenal amount of cash. I mean, isn't it 120,000?
Yeah, no, they try to make the argument then that, well, look, this is the valuation by CAB, but when you pay in cash, you get things a bit cheaper. And again, this is something that Judge Owens would would pick up on and say, well, that's quite probably true. But even if you say it's only 40 grand, like, where did the 40 grand come from as opposed to the 120?
Oh my God.
But the 50 grand, say, loan or gift, whatever it was from the relative, then that went back to the relative in terms of they got a refurbishment done on their house. And again, there was kind of a calculation of how much that cost, and, was it equivalent to the 50 grand or a bit less, 32,000? And funny enough, there was they took out a top-up mortgage, which they ended up using then to buy a luxury car, a BMW X5, I think, or something like that. It was at the top end. And there was a valuer from a bank had come out to look at the house for this top-up mortgage, and remarked about the high standard of the work that had been carried out, and it was really done to the nth degree, and it was it was a stylish job, well done. So it kind of there was obviously no expense spared in this extension, which obviously his side then were trying to claim that it wasn't all about. It wasn't necessarily as much as CAB were trying to claim it was.
This is the house at Hazelbury Park we're talking about, which is the family home.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Because do you know that house? And it is beautifully done, actually, because I've seen it. I haven't been in it, but I've seen it on Facebook or one of these things. Somebody was showing it off, probably, I think maybe his wife. And it is actually really tastefully done and very well plastered, I have to say. But only because back in the day, certainly after the ATM raid, it was suspected that he, at that point, had collected 6 million, and they reckoned that he was a cash spender. He had it in cash. And when at one point there was a raid on his house, and the Gardaí went through the cavity walls, because that's where they reckoned that the money was. They were sure that there was money in the cavity walls. Found nothing, but they had to get replastered. So that's why it looks so well. If the same thing happened to my house, I'd probably do the same. But I can tell you, nobody's going to be finding anything in the cavity walls of mine. So CAB are ultimately looking, are they, to take this home from him and his wife, to seize it and to forfeit it to the state?
Yeah, I mean, basically what they were looking for this week was a ruling, as far as I understand it. They were just looking for a ruling that it was bought with the proceeds of crime, and then the next step after that then is to get the order that had been turned over. And then, of course, the judge hasn't actually made his ruling on it yet. So presumably that can be appealed. And then if it is ruled the proceeds of crime, then the next court order, telling the Saunders to hand over the home, presumably that can be appealed as well. Or they can try and sit tight for as long as they can, as another criminal was doing this week as well. You can just sit tight and wait until they kind of more or less threaten you with a contempt of court and put you in jail before you finally, hand over the keys and walk away.
And, in some cases they do. It's like any civil proceedings. In some cases, I think that when, the heat dies down on it and maybe they realise that, this is, we're going to lose the house. Sometimes they come to the table and they do a settlement and they'll come up with money to pay off or whatever, or they could do a deal. And the Criminal Assets Bureau are perfectly entitled to and able to do that in the same way, an individual would be, because in the long term it saves money on legal fees, court dates, etc., and it can work out the best for everybody. So anyway, the Saunders aren't at the position that they want to give over their family home.
No. I mean, yeah, they were fighting it. They were fighting it all the way, and I mean, they went through. They pretty much tried to have an answer for everything the Criminal Assets Bureau came up with, and they in turn had answering affidavits rebutting the Saunders' case. For instance, I think Tammy's affidavit that the blinds and curtain firm, how could it be a money laundering vehicle? There was almost, there was very little going through it, and it was just a cottage industry set up by her mother in 2004, and there was really, she'd worked there as a kid, and it only just kind of got more involved when she was 18, and that it was describing it almost like a kind of a paid hobby rather than a business. But I don't think that was. It's hard to, I don't think that was necessarily taken on board by the CAB officials, and I think they came back with their own affidavit explaining it in extreme accountancy details, which are way beyond me, to be honest.
So this will probably continue to go back and forth, and it will eventually culminate in there'll be a decision made and then whatever. But in just to go back to the free legal aid before we go on to some of the other cases you heard, but that free legal aid, Gilligan obviously got it because he was the first case, one of the first big cases up, and because he got free legal aid, that's why he appealed everything all the way and didn't go on for 20 odd years and cost the state 20 million and all the rest of it. And I think in more recent times, the Criminal Assets Bureau, because when they were established, they'd nothing to look back on. They were just a fresh agency and they were learning all the time. But I think nowadays, when any of these people do apply for free legal aid, they fight that all the way and as strongly as they can. Most notably, the Byrne organised crime group went in and applied for free legal aid when they took the case against them. And the affidavits that the Criminal Assets Bureau put to the courts to object to that free legal aid literally blew open that whole organisation from the point of view of what we could report on. Everybody was named. Many of them were on social welfare while also believed to be bringing in millions of euro from drug dealing. And they ultimately lost the case for free legal aid, and they had it settled up within weeks after that because they weren't prepared to put their hands into their own pockets to fight the law or the state. So anyway, going back to who else was up and what else did you hear?
Well, the other it was an interesting one, I think, came up. And again, you can show you, I suppose in a sense, free legal aid doesn't come into this one. Dean Russell, and he's been described as a veteran gangster with lots of links to feuding gangs in Coolock and the North Inner City Dublin. His brother Anthony Russell was shot dead by, I think, the gang that were opposed to Christy Griffin. If you remember that kind of Oriel Street feud, it was called. It's pretty nasty one. And I think, Russell himself was the subject of 2 assassination attempts, like 2 separate ones, a couple of years apart, by some pretty heavyweight criminals as well. And that was all kind of in the affidavit in the original CAB hearing, which I think was in about 2014, where they kind of outlined, his criminal background, and that I think it was an apartment in Santry and an apartment in Malaga, and his family home it's in a north part of Dublin, and that these were the assets that they were going after. Now he represented himself, and he when the ruling went against him, he appealed it to the appeal courts. They were saying last Thursday that there was even documentation lost regarding his file in 2019 when it went to the Court of Appeal. So again, this is a case, when you look up the case number, it's a 2010 case. Now, I don't think it actually reached the courts until 2011. There wasn't a ruling until 2014. He appealed it in 2019. He lost that. The judgment came in 2020. He lost that. And then we found out on Thursday that he had since been refused permission to bring it to the Supreme Court. All done, under his own steam. He didn't have a solicitor representing him because obviously he didn't have free legal aid. And he had informed CAB that he wasn't going to be there on Thursday. And there was evidence, there was affidavits read out or information read out to the court that he was still in occupation of the house. There was proof of the service of the order on him, that he knew about it, and the judge more or less said, right, I'm going to give you the order and I'm going to commit him to prison for contempt of court, but I'm going to stay it until Monday morning. So that's kind of where Dean Russell stands now. I mean, and his appeal really centred on the family home, which he said was his a home and included 4 adults living there. So presumably the apartment in Santry in Malaga, that he's accepted that, and I think it mentioned that there had been receivers appointed to those 2 properties, so presumably they've since been disposed of, and whatever cash has gone back to the exchequer for that.
What kind of age is he, Eamon Russell? What kind of age is he?
To be fair to him now, I think he's about 52 or 3. But
right.
He's not someone that would have been kind of hitting the headlines from our point of view, but obviously the guards were taken very seriously. His kind of most serious conviction he seems to have is from a post office robbery in the 90s. And having said that, he bought his house for €53,000 in 95. So obviously, I suppose as far as the guards are concerned, that certainly helped him get on the property ladder. his real business of being a bank robber or a post office robber.
He sounds like the kind of guy that's incensed that, the cab should come looking for his home. A lot of this belief that people have. I mean, he's representing himself, obviously. He's somebody who has survived assassination attempts. Rattling up to court on particular days probably isn't ideal for him, but nonetheless, he's been attending somewhat, although not in the last occasion. A lot of these criminals get this, sense of how unfair it is that the Criminal Assets Bureau should come after them at all, don't they? They just...
Yes, just because it's criminal money doesn't mean it wasn't hard earned. I think it's the kind of the philosophy, you can kind of understand that to some extent, but it's, I suppose when you break the rules, but the bankers do it as well, so why can't we do it? But that's beside the point. I mean,
how many times have we heard that? Yeah,
and
there is a point to it.
Well, it's not a valid one, I wouldn't think. I mean, just because someone else is doing something wrong doesn't mean you should, get away with it as well. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, lock up the bankers and the bank robbers, if they're doing something wrong. But I mean, Dean Russell certainly seemed to have a chip in his shoulder, because he has actually given a few interviews to the media over the years. And one of them in 2018, he went on to Joe Duffy's Lifeline to complain about the heavy-handed guards. Now this is the same organisation that saved his life on 2 occasions previously. And he's ringing up Joe Duffy to give out about the fact that they were banging on his door at 5 to 4 in the morning to serve a warrant, as far as he said, for speeding. So, he says, I thought there was someone dead. That reminded me of, when my brother had been shot. This is all stuff he said to Joe Duffy. And that, he wasn't going to allow himself to be taken away and humiliated, as he called it. So he hopped out the back window and ran off, according to his own account, and then surrendered himself to the guards later on his own terms. So I think that gives you an idea of, I suppose, his mindset. I mean, when he spoke to our colleague Neil Featherstone in 2015, shortly after the last attempt on his life. And again, it was the same thing of I don't know who these guys are. I wouldn't even know them to see. And he said, I don't owe anyone any money. And, and if there was a problem, I'd know about it. So it's kind of, he's trying to have his cake and eat it, in both ways. And he mentioned the fact that he was a chairman of a local football club and he just wanted to live life. And he was upset that his family and his name was being dragged into all this. And admittedly, he did have a bit of a dealing with the cab in the past, but that was all behind him now. So anyway, that's still ticking away. Yeah. But it does show you, though, how once the Criminal Assets Bureau, once they start the machine rolling, it doesn't really stop. It just keeps going. Yeah,
you may give up something because they're not going to walk away empty-handed. Isn't that it? Was there something about the Waldrons up?
Oh yeah, David Waldron
was
back again. Yeah, I mean, I think in May I was there, and there was some good stuff about the. Again, it was the legal aid issue, which they had successfully got legal aid, himself and his wife again, and the Criminal Assets Bureau had taken it to the appeal court, and it was appealed, and I think the CAB won that case, so it had bounced back now again to the proceeds of crime court, and they were also saying that not only did they win the appeal, but there was now new evidence to show that they had more unexplained spending, including $5,000 that they spent in a hotel for a christening party. And they were trying to explain then there was I think he was dealing cars on done deal. So he suggested then in one affidavit that one of these cars that they'd sold off was only for a couple of £100, and it was just something, it was a little hobby that his 9-year-old son was involved in, that his son was actually doing up cars. And that's where some of the money was coming from. So, but anyway, look, yeah, this week it came up again in terms of they were looking in for a very specific, I suppose, help. They're looking for free legal aid. They were looking for the equivalent of €11,000. And the reason it's equivalent was because they were looking for a forensic accountant based outside the jurisdiction, I think in either Northern Ireland or the UK, who was going to go through the CAB file and obviously put a report together and an affidavit so that they could try and rebut the case against them.
So, sorry, they're looking for free legal aid to pay a forensic accountant to go through the Criminal Assets Bureau documents to see what they can find that's wrong. So, in other words, they're looking for the state to pay, for the taxpayer to pay for that.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, yeah, I think you put it a bit more succinctly than I did, Nicola. Yeah, but that's it. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think Judge Owens, with his typically forensic mind himself, he said, yeah, he would. Like he agreed to do it. Now the argument from CAB was like, both the fees and the hourly rates, and the time going to be taken were excessive. And Judge Jones says, well, look, he said, I'm gonna make a ruling that they're gonna get free legal aid based on how long it took me to read the file. And he basically said that was €8,000. So he partially gave them what they wanted,
Right.
but he did his own calculations on how much he felt it should cost straight there and then. I mean, this is the type of argument that in other courts could go on for days about, and you'd have to bring in an expert to say, well, how long will it take you to read the file?
Exactly, yeah.
So I mean,
and everyone would have to pay, yeah.
So in one sense, it's a simple enough thing, and to be honest, like that, when you say it's coming out of the taxpayers' money, it'll probably eventually come out of the seized assets. Like when they eventually do lose the case, which like they don't seem to have an answerable case from what I've heard in court. I mean, you've been in there as well. And I mean, there's a huge amount. I think it's 2.9 million of unexplained wealth. I mean, you can't kind of, like, there's no easy way to disguise.
At the centre of it is this house down in Wicklow, Wexford Way.
In Wexford, yeah,
And
Darview.
It is
it's called, yeah.
in Wexford. That's right, Darview. Yeah. I can actually see it. I could get there if somebody put me back into the area, but tell me what county it is in it from here, and I don't know. Anyway, Wexford. Thank you. It is absolutely stunning, this house. Architect designed, attractive looking from the front, but from the back, it has these sort of like 3 levels of views overlooking the mountains and the rolling countryside, the rolling hills. These superb glass balconies, windows everywhere. There isn't a little bit of the view that hasn't been captured within the house. There's a paddocks outside it. I mean, it is just gorgeous. And this was the holiday home, and
I think, Nicola,
again,
you should become an estate agent the way you're selling that property.
Listen,
They're fabulous.
do you know what? I'm not able for this cab stuff anymore. I've decided I can't even go there. And I go in, and when I hear them looking for free legal aid, I get myself into this like knot of rage, and I get all tense and everything. I wouldn't be able for it. I wouldn't be able to work in the Criminal Assets Bureau. I'm just saying now. And, I can dip in and out of it, but I can feel myself even getting worked up here now talking about it.
Well, I mean, I think in the long run, I think in the long run, a lot of these fees would be recovered. I think Waldron was the first of, since Judge Jones was appointed, he was the first to start looking for free legal aid. And the fact that, you're entitled to free legal aid when it's a criminal case. It doesn't matter who you are, if you're on serious charges. And you can argue, I know people say it's, why should we be paying for criminals? Well, the point is, you'd have a very different view of it if you're the victim of some kind of, a conspiracy, or somebody's cocked up the investigation, or people are flat out lying about you or whatever. You'd be very thankful that you don't have to pay for basically the best barristers that are available. And in fairness, it keeps the criminal justice system on its toes, that, the best minds are there and they're getting paid. And, and nobody's cutting corners, and justice is being seen to be done, which I think is important. Whereas, if you compare it to a system like the States, where you're rewarded for snitching, and the wealthier you are, basically the more trouble you can tend to buy yourself out of. It's rich man's justice in the US, whereas here, in fairness, it is egalitarian in that sense. Now, there's no free legal aid when it comes to civil cases. Otherwise, you could clog up the system with, people accusing people of leaving their bins in the wrong place outside their house if they didn't have to pay the 10 grand to go to the High Court to get an injunction to stop me putting my bins in the wrong place. So you can see why, in that sense, you can't have free legal aid in the civil court. I suppose in the Criminal Assets Bureau, it's slightly different. It is a civil court, but it's touching on criminal matters, but it's not a criminal trial either. So,
yeah,
I suppose it's open, and I think Judge Owens has been taking it on a case by case basis. So you just have to keep going in that regard.
He has, and I think probably, I know I've calmed down now. Thank God there's one of us sensible today. But I think actually, funny enough, Judge Owens is willing to hear both sides, and maybe in some cases that the argument against the free legal aid isn't robust enough from the CAB, and that's probably why he's granting it, But anyway, so we'll move on from that. Was anybody in court?
No. There were two smaller cases, and that actually didn't they didn't come to any conclusion. And I'm hanging on to the information for a little bit longer. They might turn out to be decent stories down the line. But although one of them, speaking of money being suspected of being hidden in cavity blocks, in one case the money was actually found behind the moulding in someone's house. Ooh. So it does happen. So I mean, being a plasterer in that regard might be successful, but that wasn't the Stephen Saunders case. It was another one that's still taking along. Yeah. And I mean, that gentleman did turn up in court and interrupted once or twice, and was and I think and at one point then opened his mouth only to have Judge Jones kind of loudly say no. And then there was another pair turned up. And I think it was a house that had been seized some time ago. Or no, he actually made the order on Thursday. Mm-hmm. And these two gentlemen turned up, an hour after the hearing was over in their case, and said, "Judge, we're sorry, the traffic, I couldn't find a solicitor north or south to help me out." And Judge just said, "No, you can find a solicitor now and you can appeal it." So he wasn't going to rehear the case. I mean, even at that stage, I mean, why would you? I mean, the people who were involved, some of them, I think, were gone at that stage. There was different, cab counsel involved. So I mean, but they were the only two. So there was none of the people that we've mentioned, like Stephen Saunders or Dean Russell, hadn't on this occasion turned up. But they sometimes do, I think.
Yes, and they sometimes do. Sometimes people don't show up at all.
The Gilligan ladies were pretty, were pretty. Surefire. They seemed to enjoy the day out nearly or something. I don't know, but they were there a lot.
And I was in another day, and Bottler Devoy was in with his mother, and there was a application they had seized, I think, some money in a raid on his house or some sort of an arrest. There was money, and he was kind of going in to see if he could get it back, but he hadn't a hope. But his mother came in with him for the day, and she was very chatty with me. She was a very pleasant woman. She gave him a bit of a nudge and said, there's Nicola Tallant.
Thanks, Ma.
And he wasn't too pleased.
I wouldn't think so.
It's always the way.
Poor old Mammy's dragged in then to give evidence that, that was money my granny gave me that I passed on.
Yeah, but he just didn't look so tough for that moment, with his mother making a show of him.
I suppose
we're all the same, really.
Everyone has a Mammy at some point, somewhere down the line.
Yeah. So look, was it a good day for Cab? Was it a good business day? Good
for the Sunday World, I guess it was. Yeah, normally, I mean, Judge Jones is so quick; he can fly through stuff, and you're done and dusted by 10 to 1. But there was quite a lot of material, so it actually went on for 2 days, and it was 2 full days. So I'm just putting in a big expense claim now for having to sit in court for extra time.
I know what you mean. Okay, well, look, that's interesting anyway. That gives us a little bit of an idea of what these lists are about, what sort of business has been done on a day-to-day basis. And maybe you're right, it probably isn't for the public really, because it is complex, and oftentimes you or I even need the details of it to be explained afterwards by some kindly lawyer who takes a bit of pity on you. And many of them are very helpful and good with their time to just explain it. But so that's that. And Cab is, I think, figures out there in the last couple of weeks show they've had, another bumper year and brought in millions and millions in cash and houses and jewellery and everything for the state. They continue and remain such a wonderful arm in the fight against organised crime.
Yeah, I think it's certainly been one of the most effective pieces of legislation. I mean, we spoke about it before after the recent sanctioning of the Kinahan gang when we went on about Johnny Morrissey. And all those kind of English criminals, English-based criminals and, Dutch criminals who had kind of set up in Ireland in the mid-90s or earlier than that. I'm going to use this would be the new Costa del Sol, or Costa del Crime in the rain. And they just legged it. They saw the writing on the wall. I mean, the likes of the Penguin and these guys, they left. Bomber Kavanagh left, So it's been an effective piece of legislation and an effective unit that seems to have been well run over the years. Maybe it could even be a bit bigger. I mean, I have great interest in some of the smaller cases, the ones I mentioned to you where, I mean, I think we did one not so long ago on a moneylender in Kilrush in Clare. And, okay, it's a small town. It's not a big international drug dealer, but, it's somebody who's, a corrosive influence in a small town, in a community. And I think I think it can be really effective in those things. And I think they do have, the local profilers that kind of look for, targets that they can go after, in that regard. And I think the more they do that, the better. I mean, obviously they need to keep going after the multimillionaire gangsters, but I think they need to keep going after the community-based bullies as well.
Absolutely. I mean, when the community see the BMWs going off in the back of a truck or the houses being raided, that it just gives them a sense that they haven't been forgotten, these communities, when sometimes they feel they have. So look, Eamon Dillon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
You've been listening to Crime World, a podcast from SundayWorld.com, produced by Ian Mullaney and edited by me, Nicola Tallant. Research assistant is Claude Amini. If you like this show and love true crime, leave us a review, or why not download the free SundayWorld.com app for lots more stories from Ireland and across the globe.